John at IPT Trans. Today we're removing and replacing a valve body in the Toyota A340. First thing that you need to be aware of is the dipstick. These vehicles get real rusty and crusty, and oftentimes the dipstick gets seized into the dipstick extension on the pan. This lower part is part of the transmission pan, and sometimes it's real hard to get out. So what I would recommend, so you don't really run into that, is if you're going to pull this pan off in the car, there's a bolt up here by the exhaust manifold, and if this is sticking on you, your best bet's to take this bolt out and take it all down together. Okay, unfortunately Toyota puts these pans on with some real strong silicone, and you have to oftentimes leave one bolt in when it's almost out and kind of break some of that loose and pry the pan a little bit, or it's not going to come off. Okay. So we're taking our pan off, dipstick intact, filter. You're going to want to keep the filter bolt separate. Put the filter in the pan. Okay, you can have a few electrical connectors. There's different amounts depending on exactly which model you have, but you're just going to want to take all of those off. And you're going to have a bracket right here to hold the electronics. So oftentimes people send these valve bodies off to us, and by the time you get it back you could forget. So if you want, you could just put a little X here where that bracket is so you remember its place when it goes back together. Now, these 10mm bolts, you're going to want to take all of them out except for this gold one here, which holds the detent spring. Now we have all the bolts loose, and there's one that's still in there. You're going to be doing this in the car in all likelihood, so you don't want gravity to have all this drop on you. So you take your last bolt out, and then you're going to lower this down. Okay? When you do that, there's some stuff that's going to fall out. No question about it. These two springs, this is a blue and a red, but there's other colors that they could be, depending on the model. And there's this plastic cooler line check valve and spring. So you want to make sure you don't lose those. At that point, you have 3 accumulator pistons underneath the valve body. Now these have to get sent to us so we can see what springs you have, and we normally give you a new spring to replace it, but there's different variations, so we like the old ones to get sent to us. And these you're going to have to pull out a little bit with a pair of pliers. Now when that's all done, you want to get each one of these accumulator pistons and bag that thing up separately before you send this to us. That way we could keep everything together. And we send it back to you the same way, albeit with new springs. Now we're going to work our magic on this valve body, and in the next segment we're going to put it all back together. Alright, we've reworked the valve body, and typically this is what you're going to get back from us. You're going to get a little container of transmission assembly grease. Your accumulator pistons with the new springs are going to be packaged together. And this first spring and check ball that we took out, if you send this to us, you don't have to, but we'll put that in a separate package. Alright, these are the bolts that you took out before. There's 3 different lengths. It's kind of self-explanatory where they go, but organize them by the length of the bolt, and your filter bolts are here. We kept those separate. Alright, the first thing you're going to want to do is lube up your accumulator bores with the grease that we sent you. This one here has a piston that is up in there, and that's not going to fall out on you, but just be aware that there's a piston in there. Now you're going to be doing this in all likelihood in the vehicle, so you're going to have to defy gravity a little bit. So what you're going to want to do is on this spring you're going to put a glob of that transmission assembly grease on it to keep it from falling out. And the same with your check ball and spring. That one's definitely going to want to fall out on you. Now you have your accumulator pistons that you got back from us. You can only put these in one way. They're not going to be able to go in wrong because they're 3 different sizes. And just a side note, I've seen on the internet that people are putting washers under here or making rods to block them. And that's not going to give you the same effect as the Valvebody does. Frankly, washers do very little. And when people put the rods in, it will shift hard, but then you start breaking other stuff inside this trans, especially the intermediate sprag, which is a weak link. Also, there's a feed tube that feeds your second clutches here. That really can't fall out, but always make sure that it's back in place before you put the valve body on. Also, with the springs we send you, they're typically a little bit heavier. So, these pistons are going to push out a little bit. The idea is when you put the valve body up, you're kind of pushing them back in. It's sometimes a little bit easier to do this with 2 people, but it can be done with 1 person. Another thing is you want to make sure that your vehicle is in neutral. Okay, when we send the transmission valve body back, we have this valve in a neutral position. The slot in this valve needs to engage into this protrusion on the manual linkage. Now if you have both of them in neutral, that's going to go right in. But either way, once you're done, you've got to make sure that that's engaged properly. Otherwise you're not going to have movement. Alright, I went ahead and laid this transmission down so we could have a better view. So one other thing, there's a gasket on here. We kind of hold it into place with the assembly lube. You want to make sure that this doesn't fold over or get pinched when you're putting the valve body on, because you'll have all kinds of problems if that happens. I'm going to put this down, and the most important thing and the most common mistake that people make is not engaging this valve into the manual linkage. So you want to make sure that that's in, okay, and once it's bolted out, you can do that by moving the linkage, and you'll see the valve move along with it. So we're just going to start a couple bolts loosely. And as I said before, you're going to have to push the pistons up with the valve body. So you want to make sure that that's lined up and not bound or pinched. And you could do that by making sure that it pushes up and down. Now around this area, you're going to have the short bolts. So once you're confident that you have this lined up and everything looks okay via the 2 loose bolts, then you could kind of take that down most of the way, and that way you know your accumulator seal and the piston isn't pinched. At that point you want to put the rest of the bolts in hand tight. Once all your bolts are started, you want to kind of take them down at A little bit tighter than finger tight. Once you do that, you want to get a torque wrench, and I would not recommend doing this job without a torque wrench, set to 80 inch-pounds. Once all your bolts are tight, you want to hook up your electrical connectors. And this is another thing that kind of can't get plugged in wrong. On this particular unit, you have 4 of them. While I'm on the subject, there's a whole bunch of different variations of this particular transmission and the Valvebody type. Some of them are going to have a cable here, mostly the older units. You're going to have to remove that cable. So instead of this one electrical connector, you're going to have a throttle cable. Also, some of the valve bodies end around here, and what you're going to have are tubes that go from the valve body to the feed holes in the transmission case. If you have those, and that's also on the older units, if you have those, just make sure they go back in the right place. You may want to take a picture or do something like that before you pull the old valve body out, because I've had people put the tubes in incorrectly, and you'll have things like no reverse and other problems like that. Now, you want to put the filter on. This is a filter that you could usually reuse. It's a screen. If you're rebuilding the trans or whatever, you're going to want to change the filter. But normally, people doing the valve body are just going to clean it out. On the back, you have cork gaskets. And again, on the different variations, you may not have 3, you may only have 1, or you may have 2. But my point is, make sure they're all on here. They don't usually fall off, but you obviously need to have all of them on there, or it's not going to work right. Another thing to note is you want to clean this pan gasket rail of all the silicone. We give this thing back to you with a pan gasket instead of the silicone, because obviously when this thing's in the car, you're going to have fluid dripping down and it's hard to get silicone to set up. So you have your pan gasket, you put your pan on, tighten it back up. On a 4-wheel drive like this one, it's probably going to take more fluid than you would think. They take about 9 quarts to fill them up. So make sure you have enough on hand and just keep checking it.